Welcome to Make It Conscious, an exploration into modern spirituality and the collective psyche. My name is Max, and today I'm going to be talking about cult recovery. Very pertinent topic when we're talking about modern spirituality and indeed the collective, because I believe the formation of abusive groups where there's a codependent dynamic, in other words, a cult. I believe these groups are way more common than many of us would believe. Now, if you imagine a cult, what comes up? What images come up for you? Typically, we tend to think of spiritual cults. We tend to think of horror stories of the past like People's Temple, Heaven's Gate, where between them nearly 1,000 people lost their lives. But we need not go that far to understand that a cult is really just any group where there is a codependent dynamic going on between a leader who is a narcissist and is using the people around them as a way to suppress unresolved trauma and to regulate painful feelings of usually shame, guilt, and various other unresolved emotions. Now, I myself have been a member of certainly at least one spiritual cult, and in using my expanded definition of a cult, countless additional cults. And I don't think this is merely a reflection of my own proclivities to get involved in such situations, as much as it is a reflection of the nature of what's going on in society and what has always been going on, at least in recorded history. There's this tendency for codependent groups to emerge. But right now, I personally feel that this is a piece in a much larger puzzle, and that actually the cult phenomenon, not only has it not gone away, but that actually in some ways it has got phenomenally worse. Of course, we don't see many mass suicides like that these days, but we do see a very insidious form of psychological control happening at all levels within society, from your typical corporate workplace to families, to friendship circles, to, yes, indeed, spiritual cults, because spiritual cults are meeting a need that religion used to, allowing people to engage with parts of themselves, parts of their own unconscious mind. But of course, as we've gradually been throwing out religion over the last 150 years or so, a lot of these very manipulative, exploitative cults have come in to fill a gap in the market, if you like. And what I personally think is that inherent in the mechanics of any exploitative situation is the need to project something that's inside of you onto another person or an object or an idea. In other words, the leader, the doctrine, or the group. So I think the phenomenon of exploitative cults is this piece of a much larger sequence of events that we're seeing happening, where I think we're gradually shifting from a materialist paradigm to an idealist paradigm. And to be clear, by materialist, I don't necessarily mean shopping, consumerism, and that kind of thing, although that would be a symptom of a wider materialist worldview, which essentially says that the world is the real thing and that we exist in the world, and that although it doesn't explain consciousness, it would infer that our consciousness is somehow a product of the material world. And I often come back to this point as to how that this is very hard to prove, because what we experience is just our own experience, it's our own mind, it's our own sensations, our own feelings, our own thoughts, our own ideas, our own decisions. These empirically are not things that exist outside of our minds. We infer many things about an external world, but it's actually not evident to us to what extent that is actually just a projection, again, of our own minds onto the world. So there's been a fantastic advancement in materialist science in the last 300 plus years, which has created a kind of progress, but it's also debatable whether that has been meaningful progress in certain ways, other than perhaps how it's allowed us and facilitated our own coming to consciousness, which I feel it is doing. But it's actually now pointing us back to an alternate possibility, which is that perhaps the real world is not the forerunner, but perhaps the mind is the forerunner. Perhaps actually we need to move to an idealist paradigm that actually starts with the mind and says that whatever there is out there, and it's not denying an external world, but it's saying that it is led by our mind somehow. And so there's a lot of scientists who are jumping ship, many of them albeit quietly, many discoveries in quantum physics, for example, and in neuroscience that are just very difficult to explain under a materialist paradigm. So coming back full circle here, the cult phenomenon is in some sense like spirituality materialized. I believe that religion can be thought of quite neatly as spirituality materialized. In other words, it is taking something that is inherent to us, our own inner numinous content, our own wisdom, and encouraging us to project that onto the material, whether that is a hero figure, a being of some kind, whether it's the cult leader themselves, whether it's some kind of object or a ritual, and we then mistake these objects and these ideas for the real thing, the idea within us, or the realness within us that they actually represent. So as much as this whole show is very much about talking about psychospiritual growth, understanding what works to produce spiritual growth, but also why it works, and helping you to walk that road, the cult phenomenon and the cult recovery process is a key part of that. And it wouldn't be so far-fetched to say that going through an exploitative situation, whether it's with a narcissistic individual or whether it's a full-fledged exploitative cult, is not only a useful experience, potentially, if it's integrated, but it may even be a necessary experience for attaining to true wholeness. It's often not until a person has been strung along by their unconscious mind to such an extent and experience such painful results from that they even become aware of its existence. And admittedly, the unconscious mind is not really even best described as a thing at all, because it doesn't have any substance. It doesn't exist in some sense. You can always think of it as like a field of potential, of possibility, of expectation that could happen, that is then realized in the conscious mind. So it's not really a thing, and it's something that is by nature outside of awareness. So it's not something that is intuitively obvious as existing, but becoming aware of its influence, let's say, is a fundamental threshold in a person's path to spiritual growth. And the idea of the unconscious has only become popularized in the last, you might say, 150-ish years. Although Freud didn't discover the idea, he was largely responsible for popularizing it. But before him, there was Schelling, for example, who isn't the best known philosopher, but did a lot of very important work in this area. Without a concept for the unconscious, then what are we to make of a spiritual experience, for example? What are we to make of spiritual growth? What even is spiritual growth without a concept of the unconscious? I would make the case that spiritual growth can largely be defined as the process of making the unconscious conscious, of coming to consciousness, of developing consciousness. So without an understanding of the unconscious, one can only do things that merely look like spirituality, but it's not the real thing. So it's a very important discovery, and it really sits at the center of much of what this channel is about and what I talk and think about. And so the cult phenomenon is very, very relevant to this. It's really the other side of the coin to spiritual growth, right? Because spiritual growth is very much about freedom, coming to consciousness, and therefore having control over one's life and mind. And an exploitative cult situation is in many ways the polar opposite of that. Because it's really about fulfilling an expectation, an idea, and thinking and behaving a certain way out of fear. And as Carl Jung said, where your fear is, there is your task. Right? So by and large, the path to our own spiritual growth is lit up by what it is that we fear, because where we fear something, there's something that's not being seen, there's something that's unconscious. So by facing up to that voluntarily, we can actually make that conscious and then no longer have to react to those unresolved feelings that are compelling us to think and move in a certain way. And so in a cult situation, particularly a spiritual cult, one reason these are so insidious is because they act as a very convincing surrogate for something that we actually all aspire to, which is to become whole. And the predominant view almost is that the way to do that is through something like a religion, or is through something like a spiritual teacher. And you need a teacher, you need guidance, you need all this stuff. And I think as you move down this path, you start to realize that actually there is no other path other than the one you walk yourself. There is no other way of growing, because it is about becoming self-sovereign. It is about coming to be completely unperturbed in yourself, completely unrestricted by any fears, rather than outsourcing that onto another individual or a teaching of some kind. So this whole cult phenomenon is entirely relevant to the greater overarching process of coming to consciousness, of psychospiritual growth, moving forward as an individual, as our organizations, and in society as a whole. And so that's why I feel that the cult phenomenon is a very significant piece of a much larger puzzle that we're all figuring out together here. And I have to say, I'm certainly enjoying the process. Now, on that note, I have today released an ebook. It's called The Cult Recovery Guide. It's about 80 pages and it's available for free. So you can go to makeitconscious.com/free guide and download this guide for free. And in here, I talk about my own experiences of cults, in particular a Buddhist-inspired cult, which I was a member of for 2 years, wherein I became its leader's closest student. Those were his words, not mine. But nonetheless, I worked very closely with the cult leader for some time, and I gradually started to experience a number of conflicts about what I was doing and about him and his authenticity. But at the same time, I was very hung up on the perceived benefits I was getting from the group. So I talk about all of this in the guide. I talk about the 5 phases of cult codependency, including the conflict phase and what that's like and how you can resolve that if this is something that you've experienced. But today I just want to give you a very brief overview of the guide and also just maybe talk to you about the earlier chapters. So the first feedback I got on this book was, why are you giving this away for free? It's 80 pages. It took me some time to write. And the answer is because there's people out there I really think would benefit from reading this, people that I know who are already reading it, and I just want to get it in front of those guys. The second reason is I would like some feedback on it. So if you do download this guide, feel free to give me feedback. Any and all feedback is welcome. If you think there's any glaring omissions, for example, let me know. If you think could be written more concisely, then let me know. If you think it's not concise enough, any and all feedback, just let me know. But at some point, I may take that feedback, I may upgrade it, I may produce a longer version and then sell it on Amazon. I probably will do that at some point. But for now, I am practicing what I call habit 4 of the 7 habits of individuation, which means to contribute your unique and specific value. So this book was a very cathartic process for me. It was something that I just had to do, I had to get that out of my system. And also just to speak my truth, to say, this is what happened, this is what is happening in the world, and this is how I overcame it, and this is how, you can overcome it if you have been involved in an exploitative cult. And like I say, don't necessarily rule out the possibility that you have been in an exploitative cult just because maybe you haven't been in a spiritual cult or a very conventional looking cult. You may have been in another kind of cult. You may have been in a friendship group or a workplace or even a family that involves some kind of codependent dynamic. You may have encountered narcissists in your life. This book goes into some depth about what is a narcissist in psychospiritual terms. Like, what is really going on there in the side of the mind of a narcissist, specifically a cult leader, but cult leaders are always narcissists. So there is a utility here to anyone who has encountered a narcissist, which I think is pretty much everybody at this point in time, but as a phenomenon it's becoming a lot more understood. So if any of that rings true to you, I would encourage you to check it out. Now, I'm just going to discuss, I think, the first chapter, which is the introduction, and I'm going to run through with you 3 myths about cults, which I have just alluded to actually. The first is that cults look like cults. Now, of course, cults do not look like cults, because if they did, no one would ever join. So they actually work very, very hard to sometimes look completely the opposite of a cult. And it's very possible to spend some time in a cult, maybe even years, before you actually come to realize that it was exploitative. And I go into depth in this book about how that happens, how cults actually avoid detection, the methods they use, but also what's going on inside the mind of someone who is caught up in an exploitative situation. Because ultimately, there's a part of us, if that happens, that doesn't want to see what's going on. And if it wasn't for that, then these groups wouldn't exist. So I think there's a key point here in that I'm not about pointing the finger and blaming people and saying, if only that person didn't exist, or if only that group or that behavior didn't exist, then my life would be okay. When you come to the idealist paradigm, you come to understand that that is actually quite fallacious, because what that's really doing is saying, if only the world could be fixed somehow, then I would be happy, right? But of course, what we experience in the world is a reflection of our own minds. So actually, it's a way to avoid doing our own inner work. And it's not excusing what other people do. It's not denying evil or unwholesome or unskillful behavior in the world. It's actually acknowledging it face on. But it's also asking a question saying, well, why is this a problem for me? And moreover, like, how has my mind brought this about? So one of the main reasons cults don't look like cults is because we actually are looking for something that looks exactly like what it is they appear to be offering. And if it wasn't for our own unconscious needs, whether it's a need for belonging, security, spiritual pride, right? The need to be better than other people, perhaps on some lofty level, but to present it in a way that's actually very humble and placates that conflict of actually wanting to be better on one hand, but on the other hand, not wanting to appear as though you want to be better, right? So a spiritual cult can provide a very sneaky way of regulating that conflict, which will inexorably, of course, come back and bite you eventually, as it did for me. So myth number 1, cults do not look like cults. As I say here, no one joins a cult. They join a spiritual community, a meditation group, a Christian congregation, a Buddhist Sangha, a self-help group, etc., etc. So let's move on to the second myth of cults, and that is that only certain kinds of people join a cult. Now, I think, to preface this, if we were to believe that only a certain kind of person joined a cult, we might actually make ourselves more susceptible to becoming exploited through that belief. Because if we believe that only naive people would join a cult, not like us, right? Not like us non-naive people, right? We've identified as really wise and really secure in ourselves and experienced. Well, if that's how we identify, with no capacity to ever do anything that closely resembles naivete in any facet of our lives, then we're likely to be attracted to things that look like wisdom, that look like evolution, that look like we've really got it together. What do you think these cults are offering? They are offering exactly that kind of experience, something that looks like all of those things, like spiritual maturity, stability. And so if we disidentify as naive, we're actually, by chasing something that looks like maturity, our shadow naivete will inevitably present itself. It has to. We get attracted to something that looks like how we identify, that turns out merely to be a representation of it, not the real thing. Again, this ties in with the idealist paradigm, right? Because we're saying that what we're actually engaging with out there in the world is merely a symbol of what it purports to be. It's not the real thing. Just like the statue of Jesus is not actually Jesus. Just like the Bible is not actually the truth, right? In some ways, there may be elements of it that are more true than true, to quote Jordan Peterson, insofar as they are symbolic. It's not the literal elements of them that is really salient here. It's what it represents. And in much the same way, a cult is not really giving us what we feel that it is. It's merely placating a need to look at a inner reality and an unresolved feeling. Perhaps the feeling of being seen as naive in this particular example. So ironically, the person who doesn't want to be seen as naive actually ends up bringing about a situation where they are forced to face the feeling of being naive. It doesn't mean they are naive at all. It just means there's a fear of them being seen that way, and they have to confront that fear. And if they push it away, they will inevitably create a situation where actually it flies back in their face, and they have to face the feeling they've been repressing all this time. The truth is that anybody can fall into a exploitative situation. And until you've had an experience of being strung along by your unconscious mind, you're unlikely to respect its capacity and its power to do that. And in actual fact, it's at play all the time. And what we're actually conscious of is an infinitesimally small portion of what we might call reality. And like I said at the start of this video, I think a form of mild codependency is pretty much ubiquitous throughout our culture at this point in time, because we've fallen for an overall worldview that says the world is the real thing. We just fix the world and we don't have to deal with our inner conflicts. That then encompasses things like, well, just get people to behave the way we want, right? Like, forget about real connection, forget about empathy, forget about being open to being transformed by other people and our experiences, and stepping into that role of transforming others at the same time. But instead, just trying to get them to do what we want them to do through deception, through coercion, sure, but actually, I think it's a lot more subtle than that. I think that we are actively fed a warped idea of love by our media, and we think generally that true connection is like making each other happy, right? Meeting expectations, giving each other what we want. But that's not true love. That's not true connection. True love is active goodwill for all creatures. And it can only come about as a result of letting go of what we're pushing away in ourselves. And that's simply not possible unless we are open to the idea of the unconscious and understand that what we are experiencing is actually a reflection of ourselves. So it wouldn't be so extreme to say that maybe we're all part of a cult. Maybe we are all part of a global cult that is actually built on codependency. And we tend to call it codependency when it breaks up in some kind of argument or things really break down, but we need not wait for that to happen to really call it what it is. And what it is leaders trying to withdraw individual self-sovereignty and get them to project it onto alternatives. Like stealing the flowers from someone's front lawn and then selling it back to them. The true sage doesn't do that, right? The true sage isn't fooled by the metric of money in their pocket. They know they haven't delivered value in doing that. There's no egoic workaround for them. And why would you want one? Okay, so myth number 3 is that people affected by cults should just leave and move on, right? You know it's a cult now, you know it was exploitative, you know you're being gaslit, you know that the leader was a narcissist. Yeah, get over it, just move on. Again, this comes from a misconception about how the mind really works. The reality is that the mind in many ways works quite a bit like how we perceive the physical world to work. In the physical world, we see that there is rather, energy, right? We perceive things as moving with energy. We understand mechanics. We understand that if you apply energy to an object, it's going to move until it gets resisted by an opposing force or redirected somehow. This is particularly notable if you look at objects in space, right? If you look at an asteroid flying through space, it doesn't just like slow down gradually in like a football would on Earth, right? It just keeps going until it's met with energy coming at it from another direction, or if it hits something, for example. So energy cannot be created or destroyed, it can only be transferred. And the mind works in the same way, right? Like if there's energy that has been exerted on the mind and it's been buried and made unconscious and not been resolved, then it has to balance out at some point. It has to come back to center. And I think that a lot of what we encounter in life can actually be explained by energy trying to reconcile. So if we've experienced a lot of negative feelings, we've not made them conscious, we've pushed them away, repressed them, then at some point that's going to have to come up, right? It's like a balloon being pushed underwater. Eventually it's just going to come up, right? And we're exerting energy to try and keep it down. So this is why it can be so liberating to let go of unresolved emotions. But the truth is that even once you intellectually understand something, there is still a process to go through of working through the feeling. And this is like one of the most underutilized tools in self-development and spiritual growth. And I would refer to it simply as facing up to feeling. Now, as I mentioned, I was involved in a Buddhist cult for some time. And if you look at many Buddhists, they are very calm, peaceful people. They're not especially emotional much of the time. They're generally pretty joyful. But they're not expressing a lot of sadness and anger, that's certainly for sure. So would it be logical then to presume that we should just behave as they do? Not show sadness, not show anger, as a way to develop ourselves spiritually? Is that not the goal? A bit of light modeling and just do what they do, get their results? Well, you see, the thing is, that again would be to insist upon the image of something and mistake it for the real thing. The real thing that's going on there is that a legitimate practitioner who is appearing that way because of a genuine, peaceful inner world has not got there by suppressing their emotions. They got there by resolving their emotions. And the only place anything ever gets resolved is in consciousness. It doesn't go away by ignoring it, right? It has to be worked through. It has to run its course. And facing up to feeling is how we do that. That is simply the process of giving bare attention to the feeling, the physical pattern of sensation, and allowing it to dissipate. And so in understanding the situation, that can certainly point us to the feeling. Examining the storyline, repeating the storyline, seeing what comes up. But understanding that the storyline isn't true is not a full resolution, but it can point us in that direction. It's only fully resolved once it's made conscious. So no matter how well you understand the cult or any challenge you go through, it has to be worked through emotionally. It's absolutely vital. And what we find is that as much as we don't want to go there, it's really the idea of going there that is the most repellent to us. Actually going there, actually experiencing it, is never as bad as the ego would have us believe. In fact, any emotion is really a concept that our mind gives to a pattern of physiology, right? It's a felt sensation. So you could say that all we really fear is a pattern of sensation in the body and the ideas that our mind creates about it. But they themselves only point to physical sensation. So it's not really the idea that we're scared of, it's the sensation. It's all there is. All there is our own experience. So there you go. Those are 3 myths about exploitative cults. And if you're interested in cult recovery coaching, you can get in touch with me on the website. You can get in touch at makeitconscious.com. There's a contact me page on there, check it out. You can also go to makeitconscious.com/free guide to get your copy of the cult recovery guide. I'll just go back to the contents page briefly and just talk you through what's in this guide. So I start out by talking about my own personal cult story, talk about codependency in society, why I feel it's a pertinent topic in this day and age, and also I drill down into one particular experience of this Buddhist cult which I mentioned, which lasted a couple of years, and how I got involved, how I eventually realized that it wasn't what it purported to be, and how I then resolved it and recovered from it. I then talk about what actually is a cult, like what makes a cult, and what is so dangerous about a cult, and also including that are the main kinds of cult. I then talk about how cults avoid detection, and I then talk about undue influence. So this is actually like how cults not only harm us, but also maintain control over their members through behavior, information, thoughts, and emotions. I then talk about the cult leader themselves. So we really get into the mind of the cult leader. A lot of people who leave cults find that's a really powerful part of their recovery. It's coming to actually understand what was going on inside the mind of the cult leader. That's really important. I then talk about the 5 phases of cult codependency. And I also talk about my own story through those 5 phases as they unfolded. That's really good for understanding where you are in the process, but also what the opportunities and dangers are at each stage. I then talk about how to actually go through a skillful exit and recovery. And in there I talk about shadow work, which is something that I do in my coaching practice, and also the need to find a new model. So it's no good just going out the frying pan into the fire, or the analogy I use is that it's no good just like diving off a ship into the stormy ocean unless you know there's an island you can swim to that's a lot more solid and robust, where you can set up camp and actually make a life for yourself. So there I really talk about, well, what next? Like, don't ignore the experience, understand the experience is part of your journey, integrate the experience, understand how you can then use the experience, not just to help yourself and understand your direction from there on in, but how you can actually be of use to others, either who have been in a similar situation or simply can benefit from the skills you developed through the experience and recovery. And lastly, I talk about the 7 habits of individuation. So this is a modality which I curated based on the wisdom of sages that I've known and from history, historical texts, and my own spiritual practice. And it's really a way of life for individuation or spiritual growth, of coming to know yourself and make the unconscious conscious. So this is the model that I use. This is what I then started doing as a result of leaving the cult, and it's how I gear my life now to make sure that I stay on this path and that my life is pretty comfortable. So that's the final chapter, and I'm going to actually be making more content on that as time goes on. I've also got an audio program on that you can check out, again, via the website. So I'm going to leave that there today, guys. I hope that was interesting, and I shall speak to you next time.